All right, Cade and Seb here today. This is Seb Bunney. We are going to be talking about money some more. Seb, I got to know him a month or so ago in Montana, hanging out, and found out in that conversation that he's actually written a book on money and works in money pretty deeply. And over the last few weeks, I've read his book and realized, and we were just talking a minute before recording, that we have almost the exact same verbiage around money in the way that we view the role of money in people's lives and societally, and then also the implications of unhealth money. So I think this will be a fun conversation talking with someone, talking to you about this today. So appreciate you joining us.
Oh man, honestly, it's my pleasure. And again, like as Jim just mentioned, we only met like a month or so ago. And there's something so amazing about meeting like-minded individuals because when you're spending time with people that are curious, you really can dive into all of these different topics. And it's amazing how aligned you are in so many of these different topics. And when you're not aligned, there's a curiosity there because you know how much time and energy they're put into getting to the point at which they're at. And so I find being around like-minded individuals, curious individuals, malleable individuals is just such a pleasure. And so I had a blast in Montana. I'm looking forward to chatting.
Well, we could take this conversation a lot of ways. I don't know. A lot of the premise of your book, chapter after chapter, is sort of discussing like the implications of bad money and how it impacts different areas of life. So I guess, do you want to start us off there? Like, what makes money good or bad? And then obviously that could be a whole conversation itself. And then sort of going from there to like what can be implications personally, familially, societally with having good or bad money.
Absolutely. So this is, oh man, again, it's such a big conversation. And I think that a lot of people, we never actually ask the question of just like, what is money? And I think if you ever go and listen to Robert Breedlove's podcast, What is Money? He's got some amazing people talking about this idea. But there's so many different ways that you can talk about this. And I think really to start is that we have a society that has a fear around money. There's a negative connotation around money. It's like, don't talk about money. Money is the root of all evil. There's a lot of these kind of like negative sayings related to money. But if you actually just kind of step back for a second, money is really just a tool. Money is apolitical, money is amoral, just like how you can use a knife to go and carve up food to share food with the family, you could use it in negative ways as well. And it's the same thing with money. Money itself is not inherently bad, but I think that the reason why there is this negative connotation around money is the fact that over time, our money is increasingly being impacted to the point where it's not serving us in the same ways it's done in the past. And that means that it impacts how we show up as individuals. And so I think if I was to kind of take this conversation in kind of one direction, it would be that the way that I tend to look at money is like language. Money is a medium of expression. It's how we express to the world what it is that we value. Just like how through language we're able to communicate, express to the world what it is that we value, well, you can see money is exactly the same. If I go into a grocery store and I see someone purchasing grass fed beef, organic vegetables, and then I go and see someone else going and purchasing cigarettes, microwave meals, you can see by how they direct their money what it is that they value. But I think that the problem which we face today in society is that as we're seeing more and more intervention monetarily and our purchasing power is being decimated, well, that's impacting what it is that we're directing our capital towards because we can maybe no longer afford to buy the good quality food to support our families and our kids. We may no longer be able to direct capital into certain areas of the economy because we're seeing capital regulations that are preventing us from directing capital there. Or let's say I live in China and you've got capital controls. If I want to go and save up and try and protect my family by saving my pennies and trying to build for a better life, there's capital controls that prevent me from investing overseas and protecting my purchasing power so the government can devalue the currency, impacting my ability to protect my family. And so I think that there are these things, whether it's inflation and the devastation of purchasing power, whether it's capital controls preventing me from moving my money outside of certain borders, whether it's regulation preventing me from directing capital to certain areas of the economy, that are actually impeding our ability to express ourselves monetarily in a way that is healthy and in a way that is able to build a future to our liking. I'm curious to hear what you guys' thoughts are.
I mean, even just foundationally, how we define what money is. Like our working definition of money is a means of communicating, storing, and transferring value across space and time. So you mentioned that money is is a means of expression, and we would say that money is a means of communicating. And of course, the way that you use your money, be it save it for the future, spend it on healthy food, spend it on uh, a quick pleasurable purpose, or spending it to put a roof over your head, you're communicating that this something is important to me. And I'd venture to say, if you show someone your calendar and your checkbook, like they'll have a pretty good idea of what you value in life. And the issue is, and this is where we get in other conversations as far as the money being a primary leader to divorce and other issues, is that you can say what you might have certain words to what you value, but then your other means of expressing your time and your money are not congruent with what your words are saying. And I think that happens for a few reasons. One, it happens on the personal side of things, of not taking inventory of what's really important to you and stopping to pause. Like most people, in my observation, most people go through life reacting to their situations and maybe making a decision in a fleeting moment, and they're responding to circumstance versus sitting, thinking deeply about what is truly important to me and how do I align my resources, my time, my money, my talent, relationships, business with what I value. Thinking about the opportunity cost, the trade-offs that will come from that decision, and then finally be able to take action articulately instead of just responding, thus communicating maybe something accidentally. It's like if you stub your toe, you might say something that if you were more patient or weren't in pain, you wouldn't yell that out. Or, if you're just frustrated, my kids, I have 4 young kids, and there's times, most nights after I put the kids to bed, I take inventory of the words I said that day. And usually I have a little bit of regret of how I responded too harshly to them. It's like, man, now that they're in bed and I can think more slowly and calmly, I wish I wouldn't have responded like that to them. And I think it's how a lot of people live with their money, is responding in a way that is not actually in tandem with what they would hope it would communicate. So that's one side. And then obviously you bring in this other side of the more technical side of money as a communications mechanism for orchestrating the purchasing and selling of goods and services. And if you bring in more units of that money and everything, then also that can mess up the communication mechanism. And that's, inflation and controls. So we have two sides of things that are impacting this communication mechanism. And even that, I don't know if I'm using this term properly. I feel like this is a new term that's sort of Gen Z, is gaslighting. But I feel like a lot of times now people are feeling gaslit of, they can't buy a house for their family and they're working too much and they feel like it's all my fault. But in reality, they don't recognize that there is something else going on behind the scenes that is also disrupting what they're trying to communicate. Now, I'm not going to say that everything is the government's fault. Like maybe you are also blowing money and using it poorly, but we have to recognize there's two places coming in that's money communicates, and there's two means of distortion. There's that personal taking inventory, and there's also our money system's broken as well. And even if you're taking inventory and being very intentional about your priorities, it still can be very difficult to align the two, the priorities and your resources.
No, I think you're absolutely spot on. And I think that it's almost like the unit bias of the dollar, where it's like, well, $1 when my parents were around, $1 now, well, it's just $1. And it's just like, no, there's a very big difference in what a dollar could buy 50 years ago, 100 years ago, even 20 years ago to present day. Like when you start looking at a lot of these studies, these statistics, you realize that the baby boomer generation at the average age of 30 owned 35% of the housing market. Well, the millennial generation at the average age of 30 owns 3% of the housing market. And so you start to see that because our purchasing power has been decimated, yes, a dollar is a dollar, but where it goes, it buys far, far, far less. And so I always find it really interesting. Like we can get into the mechanics of the monetary side of things, but there's countless podcasts where you can dive into that kind of stuff. And so I find it interesting talking about more how it impacts us and how we show up as individuals and the psychology of money. And one of those areas is really like, how is it that money impacts us as an individual and how we're able to pursue the things we want, to be able to support those around us, to be able to show up authentically. And so in my book, The Hidden Cost of Money, I talk about kind of like three main areas of how money impacts us. And these areas ultimately impact really our trajectory in life and kind of what we're capable of doing. And the first one is time preference. So, time preference, for those that aren't familiar with it, you can think of it as like a spectrum. You've got on the low end of time preference and on the high end of time preference. On the low end, you've got people that are thinking about the future. They want to build an intentional life. They want to be able to increase their capacity. So they're thinking about, what can I do today, even if that takes sacrifice today to build a better life tomorrow. And then on the flip side of that spectrum, you've got the high end, high time preference thinking. And this is, you know what? I'm just going to be impulsive. I want to meet my immediate needs right now. I'm not thinking about the future. And I think that what ends up happening is when money is losing purchasing power over time, we're no longer incentivized to save. We're now incentivized to consume because our purchasing power is buying less each day. And so because of this, money is unconsciously shifting our perspective from this ability to save, this thinking about the future, to being impulsive. My purchasing power is greatest in the present moment. I'm going to spend it now. And you see this throughout society. And there's so many repercussions, whether it's on the environment because of our consumption habits, whether it's on the individual because we're not thinking about building prosperity for us and our families. Instead, we're just thinking about the present moment. And so you start to see the first aspect, our time preference shifting from low to high. And then the second aspect is like meaninglessness. Like you can really see if I'm an individual and I'm like, you know what, based on my income, I think it's going to take me 15 years to save for a down payment for a house. And then so 5 years into that 15 years, you're like, oh man, house prices have doubled. So now it's going to take me 25 years instead of 15 years. It's really easy for meaninglessness, depression, anxiety, frustration to kind of kick in when every time we set a goal, that goal ends up getting further away as opposed to coming towards us. And I think that's what a lot of millennials, a lot of individuals are feeling today is they're trying to show up authentically. They're trying to set goals, but life continues to get harder and harder and harder. So it feels like they're on a bit of a rat race. And so I think it's no wonder that we're seeing substance abuse, highest rates of depression, anxiety, these types of things. And then the final one that I'll just mention is kind of like compassion and altruism. And I should say that they're, on average, people are a product of their environment. But that's not to say that you're going to get people that have been brought up in heinous environments, challenging oppressive situations, and then being able to escape that, rise above it, and create an amazing intentional life. However, I think for the majority, when our purchasing power is being decimated, when life is getting harder and harder to be able to show up, and when we're living quite impulsively, it impacts our ability to be altruistic, to be able to give back to our society, our community. And in psychology, there's this idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it's kind of this like 5-tier pyramid. And at the top, you've got like self-actualization, spiritual beliefs. Below that, you start getting into self-esteem needs, confidence, friends, those type of things. And then as you go down the levels, you start to get down to our base needs, which is our survival needs, food and shelter. Well, the challenge is as money starts breaking down, as our purchasing power starts deteriorating, we start getting pushed down these levels and we get stuck on the bottom. Our aperture of awareness starts to narrow as a result of fear and survival instinct. And so we don't have the capacity to really give back at the same extent, to be able to be as compassionate as maybe we once might be able to. And so I think that ultimately, money is this lever which, when we have greater purchasing power, we have greater capacity to show up more authentically in general. That's not to say that everyone is like that, but I find money really does influence how we show up as individuals.
Yeah, hearing you say that, Seb, was reminding me of a meeting that we had earlier today, and there's countless meetings like this. It was the first real deep conversation that we've had with this particular person, and he's not a client. We're just kind of currently exploring, like, hey, how can we potentially help this person? He feels uh, super behind. Like, man, what have I done? I haven't saved enough for myself, haven't saved enough for my kids. I'm swamped at work because I'm just trying to play catch up. And he's putting a lot of that blame on himself, which, like you alluded to, in your book mentions, like, with if our money system is broken, we're forced to use our money and our time, frankly, in ways that don't actually reflect what our true values might be. So this as long as the money system is broken, then money as a communicator, it's not as efficient as it maybe would be if the money system was not as broken as it is. But we hear stories like that all the time of people putting blame on themselves, and there are of course cases where someone could have made better decisions, and their decisions directly impacted where they're at today. But there's so many people that are out there just grinding and doing what they can, but constantly feel like they're not making up any ground, and it's not always because you've made wrong decisions, but because something that's frankly kind of out of your control, in a sense, is the root cause of that. It's sad to see that.
Oh, I could not agree more. And I think it's challenging as well because many times as individuals or as a society, we end up constantly talking about the symptoms of this stuff. I wish I could have saved more. I wish I could have done this. Oh, this is what's happening in society. And we play to these symptoms when in reality, we need to go back to the root cause. What's really happening? And I think that at a foundational level, our money is losing purchasing power. And I always find like my background, I've always been fascinated with psychology, childhood trauma development. And so I always try and find analogies. And so we're talking about expression and the importance of expression with authenticity. Well, imagine if you grew up and your parents didn't allow you to express certain emotions. They deemed them as like negative emotions. So let's take, I don't know, frustration, anger, sadness. Nope, they're not allowed in this household. So anytime you go to feel those emotions and you express them, no, you're not allowed. What that means is as we grow up through life, if we don't know how to express certain emotions, it can lead to depression. Depression is the depressing of emotions. We never learn how to express those things. And so the symptoms of not being able to express ourselves as a kid resulted in depression, anxiety, frustration, because we never learned how to express them. Well, it's the same things with money. We look at society today and we say, man, we've got like really poor consumer habits. Because of our consumption, we're just kind of like decimating this natural environment. We're kind of destroying the forest. We're ripping up all the minerals and such. We've got kind of a lot of global issues when it comes to labor workforce, human rights, all this kind of stuff. And we're focused on the symptoms. But actually, if we go back to the root, it's the same thing as a child who has never learned to express himself as a child. We have a monetary system that doesn't allow us to preserve purchasing power and express ourselves naturally. And so I very much believe that if we have a monetary system that allows us to preserve purchasing power and save, what happens to consumption? Well, it means that people are now incentivized to save over consume, so we start to see a change in consumption habits. If we see a drop in consumption, you see less of an impact on the natural resources that are being extracted from the ground. And so a lot of these repercussions that we see in society are simply symptoms of broken money, is what I would argue.
Seb, we're back
Did I disappear there for a second?
for about 5 seconds.
What point did I get to? Sorry, because I saw you guys the whole time.
You had spoken about how you're making you were connecting how children who are grow up in a household where they cannot express their emotions. You were connecting that with having a monetary system that doesn't allow for preservation of purchasing power and saving. You're making
Did
that
I did I
connection.
mention did I mention the change in consumption habits as a result of actually having money that allows us to purchase?
I think that's right
We're
about where
getting
you
right
where we
there.
lost
Yeah.
you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that what this means is that when we actually have money that allows us to preserve purchasing power, what ends up happening is you see an incentive towards saving as opposed to consumption. So if you've got an incentive towards saving as opposed to consumption, then that impacts our consumption habits. And vice versa, if you're impacting consumption habits, you're impacting the amount we're drawing resources from the ground, the impact on the natural environment. And so you start to see that at the root of a lot of these symptoms that we face throughout society is broken money, money that doesn't store purchasing power.
Then you face this systemic, like a lot of what you're coming against is like systemic. And like I was having a conversation with someone about a week ago, and we were talking about what I believe will happen in the next decade is this proliferation of universal basic income, and I'll come on the heels of some sort of like government digital currency or CBDC that will be digital, make it easier for some sort of UBI, universal basic income. And how I believe that that happens, they'll probably have some sort of controls over, hey, Seb, if you're a good citizen, we'll give you $1,000 a month. But if you use your money in a way that we don't agree with, then the next month you'll get 500, and if you do it again, we'll cut it off. Oh, and also that $1,000 you get this month, you have to spend it all within the next 30 days before it disappears. And ironically, I said that I was telling someone I think that's going to happen. Maybe I'm crazy, but they said, "Oh, well, that'd be great because that would allow the economy to keep going because it encourages and it forces ongoing spending." And again, until you stop to question even that premise of what is money and what is an economy and what causes a healthy economy, if you think, oh, well, money is just a means of transaction and the economy is continually healthy because there's just always money in circulation, even be it arbitrarily because it just has to circulate, well, then the more money that's circulating, the healthier economy will be. You'll lead to these false conclusions. And it seems like a silly question to say, hold on, let's step back. What is money? And, people like, again, that's what Cade and I do. We've worked in money for over a decade each. And to stop and say, well, wait a second, what is money? Just sounds like a foolish question because it's so simple because we handle it day in, day out. But I think it's of paramount importance. It'd be like a master architect stopping and say, hold on, what's a ruler? But then you find out all these other architects are measuring out their boards and stuff all day, and they're going and they're building this custom home, and they're using a ruler to measure and to cut and everything. But then we find out that they never stopped asking what a ruler is, and this whole time they're measuring using a ruler that at one point it's 9 inches, the next point it's 14 inches. It's like, wait a second, what is this thing, and how does this impact how we're designing everything else? And suddenly you realize, well, goodness, if our ruler's changing, that ruler is meant to communicate the length and the standard size of something. But if the ruler is changing, well, suddenly you don't know if you're measuring the ruler, or if you're measuring the table that you're supposed to be measuring. So yeah, these are both communication mechanisms, and it seems like a simple thing. Well, what is a ruler and what is money? But if you don't stop and ask that, you might be dealing with something that is a complete, I guess, manipulated or falsified version of what you think you're dealing with this whole time.
No, you're spot on. And I think that the way I kind of tend to look at things is there's a really famous quote, and it's one of my favorite quotes, and it says, "The map is not the territory." And I think that we have these maps at which we navigate this world. One of those maps is money. It's how we think money is meant to operate. And there's a few common held beliefs around this. You kind of briefly touched on them, but there's a few common held beliefs that's just like, well, money needs to be centralized. There needs to be an issuer who controls this money. It's that our natural environment is inflationary. Prices rise over time. If we have deflation, well, that's going to destabilize our economy. And so we can't have deflation. And so there's this map that kind of tells us how money works, how our economy works. And I think it's really important, to your point, Jim, to go back and actually question those assumptions. Is this map representative of reality? And what's interesting is when you start digging into this stuff, you're just like, well, do prices have to rise over time? And if you ever go and read Jeff Booth's book, The Price of Tomorrow, what you start to recognize is you're like, wait, humans, since the dawn of time, we have always strived to get more for less. We're always trying to increase productivity, increase efficiency. And so because of our desire to increase productivity and efficiency, prices should be falling over time, not rising. But the challenge is, if prices are falling over time, we've got a debt-based economy. If margins are being squeezed, then we're going to see absolute devastation from a corporate standpoint. And so in a debt-based economy, that deflation is a threat. And so it's kind of like going back and starting to question some of these assumptions. And I think what's really interesting is this idea that like GDP, gross domestic product, needs to continually grow. Because naturally, if I want to go and release let's say I start a nonprofit and I go and release a service to this world that is free. And at the time, that service, given that it's free, it doesn't impact GDP. GDP, for those who aren't familiar, is basically just like, for any nation, it is all of the monetary transactions that take place in that nation in any given year. Well, if I'm offering a product or service for free, it doesn't impact GDP. Well, if I'm offering a service for free, does that not say that I'm creating value in society, even if it's not impacting GDP? However, if I'm struggling and I'm like, you know what, I've got to turn this free service into something that's now paid, all of a sudden that impacts GDP positively. So it looks like there's now growth in the economy. but have I actually created value, or have I actually taken value away because I've taken a product that was free and now I'm charging for it, which is impacting people's access to it? And so I think that in a society that is absolutely thriving, where technology advancing, innovation is like booming, what I actually think we would be seeing is prices falling. So in effect, we could have GDP falling while we're having absolute amazing abundance in society. And it's hard for some people to wrap their head around this.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier something that triggered this thought in my head. So a few months ago, there was another financial planner. They're talking about how a lot of millennials and Gen Zs are whining about how you mentioned the stat earlier about the number of homeowners of different demographics, and he was mentioning that like, oh well, yeah, but look at my generation, the generation before me, look at their average house was 800 square feet. It was a shotgun house, and the average closet was this size and didn't have air conditioning, versus the starter home that these kids want is the home that our parents hope they would eventually have. And I can concede that point to an extent. But what he's failing to recognize is, I would actually argue it's two things. One, the quality of a home, the quality of the average home 60 years ago is substantially greater than the quality of average home today. From the obviously there's portions of a house that's still good, but from the bare bones standpoint, the average home was better constructed. And then two is, again, going to this framework of if we have better technology and greater efficiencies in building capabilities, why should we not have better quality houses, or at least equal quality of houses, for a similar cost? And you get into this, well, only X percent, I forgot the stat you mentioned earlier, but it was X percent of, 30s own a house now versus, decades back. I don't think it's fair to point towards the fact that same starter level house is substantially better than it was then, because we have to adjust for technological advancements. And if we take that out, if we remove that from the equation, suddenly we're left with, it's the money itself. I think that is the common denominator amongst all these issues. I don't know. Maybe I'm not thinking that through properly, but whenever I heard that argument of, well, the average starter home is substantially better than it was then, again, I think that was disingenuous. And again, I would say that term that I don't really love is sort of gaslighting this generation to say, well, of course, you should go get a house that doesn't have air conditioning because that's what our grandparents had to do. When, well, of course, the technology is here that wasn't there to make that on scale on a relatively cost-efficient way.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think that the other thing is you just got to look at what percentage of people are living in apartments today as single family homes. And we've seen a huge shift, even over the last 100 years. If I remember correctly, there's a book called Tribe by a guy called Sebastian Junger. It's a fascinating book, and he talks about the shift from kind of this hunter-gatherer style lifestyle to kind of modern day, and even the transition through the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution. And one of the things he mentions is that 150 years ago, it was something like 90% of individuals lived in rural areas, 10% lived in cities, because ultimately we needed to be able to support ourselves and sustain ourselves. We had to grow our food. We have to be self-resourceful. Whereas today, because of the way we've seen mass manufacturing, mass farming, monocrop agriculture, which has had its own issues on the environment and the soil and all that kind of stuff, what we've seen is this transition where most people don't have jobs. Machinery has taken their jobs, so they moved to the city. So most people live in apartments. So instead of it being 90% living in rural areas, 10% in cities, we've now flipped. And it's now 90% in cities, 10% in rural areas. And so the amount of people that even live just in single family homes in general is like such a small amount in comparison to what it was even in our parents' day. And I think that on top of that, you're just looking at the incentives of the system today. Unfortunately, like I very much believe in a free market, which is when you create value, capital can flow towards you. And so ultimately, when you have a free market and there's no central planner that is able to fund operations without support from the populace, what it means is, again, capital flows to where value is being created. Well, that is what is most important in society, because if you're not offering value, you're going to slowly wither away and someone is going to rise up. If a company wants to be fiscally irresponsible, cool, go ahead, be fiscally irresponsible. But by the time that we have a recession or a downturn, if you can't support your expenses, you're going to wither away. Those staff are going to have to go back out into the market. They're going to have to be innovative, find another job, which creates value. There was a podcast I was listening to about 2-3 years ago. It was Lynn Alden on Peter McCormack's What Bitcoin Did. And she mentioned that in the 1920s, there was a depression before the 1930s depression that everyone knows about. And the reason why it doesn't get talked about is the fact that the depression was only 1 to 2 years long. But supposedly, it had just as much of a drawdown on the labor workforce, but it recovered in 1 to 2 years. And she argues that the reason why it recovered so quickly in relation to the 1930s depression is at the time, the Federal Reserve, the central bank, didn't have the far reaching oversight to go and intervene monetarily. And because of that, these companies were effectively wiped out. People went back into the market, rebuilt, and the economy recovered so quickly. Whereas the moment you step in financially, you create all of this moral hazard, you create all of these negative repercussions. And I'll give one quick example, which was during the pandemic here in Canada, there was this thing called the CERB, the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit. And again, I talk about it very briefly in my book, but we very much felt it. And the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit was if you're an individual and you've lost more than 10% of your income because of COVID, then you're entitled to $2,000 a month from the government. Well, $2,000 a month is freaking $24,000 a year. If you go into the tax receipts, you realize that 1/3 of Canadians earn less than $24,000 a year. So you've now just given the option to 1/3 of Canadians. Do you want to just stay at home and watch Netflix? Or do you want to go and work full time and earn the same amount? Well, of course, they're going to take the latter as opposed to the former. So you end up having all of these Canadians that effectively quit their jobs. So all of the mum and pup shops, the cafes, the bike shops, the restaurants, they could not find workers. And so most of them had to close down. Most of them went under, or even if they didn't, they'd have 1 or 2 staff members and they'd have signs up saying, we cannot find staff members. And so when you step back and you look at this, you're like, well, if people are struggling financially, give them free money. But the problem is the repercussions of giving them free money is you create all these misaligned incentives. People are not going to want to work if they've been given money for free. That impacts all of the mum and pup shops, but it didn't impact a lot of the corporate monopolies that had access to a lot of this free and easy capital. So it's a lot of these misaligned incentives as a result of broken money.
Yeah, again, money communicates things, and money is one. It's a means of communicating value. It stores value, and it's communicating that there's value that was created or derived from this, and this represents that money in turn. And I can't remember who it was, but I remember hearing there was a quick snippet talk, and he was saying, "Well, if we wanted everyone to be educated, could we just go ahead and print everyone a diploma?" Like, no, of course not, because a diploma just signifies a sense of value of an education standpoint. In the same way, just arbitrarily creating units does not all of a sudden make everyone wealthier. So I love there's a quote in the book that sort of goes in this. It says, our allocation of time holds as a direct reflection of our priorities, values, and aspirations. And then later on, you said money is, in a sense, a method of storing time. And I love how you connect those pieces. And of course, when we think of saving money, it's like, okay, well, if one, you're going to be more incentivized to save money if you believe that money is going to hold value later on, because you are effectively giving yourself opportunities, time, or other opportunities down the road. You're saying, you know what, it's more important to me that I want to have time with my family to be able to make memories in 10 years or when I'm old or whatever. So therefore, I will go without something now so I can have more time with my wife in our 50s and 60s and 70s later on. And that is one role that money's supposed to have, is preserve time and be able to transmit that time from now until a time that I feel is a date that I feel is more appropriate. And again, like if the money's manipulated, suddenly you can be stealing time from people. If I decide I want to save 20% of my income, that is 20% of the time that I have spent to deliver value. I decide I want to wait till later on to receive the benefit of that time. So therefore, I want to have that 20% of time later on. But if we have 3% inflation, well, every roughly 24 years, that the value of that dollar is cut in half. Therefore, that time, that 20% of time that I gave up, now I'm only getting 10% of that back. And so we have to, it's connecting how do all these things relate, and what's the impact of having centralized money that is, I would argue, is not, it's not actually money, or at least it's not the best form of money we can and should have.
Mm-hmm. There's an interesting quote, which is, The best slave is a slave that doesn't know he's a slave. And I've probably butchered that quote. You guys may have heard it before. But there's a Robert Breedlove. He wrote an article. This is a kind of a long form blog article post. This must have been maybe 4 years ago. And I think it was called like Masters and Slaves. And one of the things he did is let's just take a look at like the African slave trade in comparison to the decimation of purchasing power since the invention of kind of the Federal Reserve. And what you realize is that if you take into account all of the time and energy all of those slaves put into the cotton farms and whatnot in the States during that period, in comparison to the decimation of purchasing power and the extra time that people would have to work to be able to make up that purchasing power, what you realize is that we have seen, and I don't want to discount what happened in the past, but if you're simply taking the labor hours worked, we have seen an absolute far and above decimation of labor over the last, say, 50, 100 years than we ever saw during any slave trade. And people just don't know they're slaves. They're having to go and work 40, 50, 60 hours a week just to be able to get by. And even when you look at it in more of a historical context, I think we tend to think, well, we're at the forefront of technology. Life is better than it's ever been ever before. And actually, if you go back and study like hunter-gatherer tribes, the ability to go hunt big game, find good quality meat, most of the time, these individuals in the hunter-gatherer tribes were spending like 10 to 13 hours a week hunting. The rest of that time, it was on community endeavors. It was on kind of like giving back to society, being able to kind of show up more with your family, things like that, which we just don't have today. People are spending 40, 50, 60 hours at work, and they're just trying to exist. And so I think we are arguably at a time in history where we are working more than ever. We have limited capacity more than ever. And I think that a lot of people don't recognize, again, that it's stemming from a monetary system that isn't conducive to being able to save and put forward a better future.
Jack Mallers talks about that a lot. I've heard him say it several times of like, man, if the money system wasn't broken, then you could just go be a teacher. You could go be a doctor. You could go be a banker. You could just be your career and spend your time on things that are important to you. But we are, like you just mentioned, we are forced to not just be a teacher, be a doctor, be a banker. We have to do that way more than we otherwise would want to create the means to save. Because if we don't, then we're just a slave to the system.
Totally. And then on top of that, you're going and working your 40, 50 hours a week as your day job. And then you're going to have to spend another 15 hours a week trying to figure out, okay, I've saved 10% of my paycheck. Where do I go and put that 10%? And so then when we've got this monetary system that doesn't allow us to simply save in the currency, well, we've now got to figure out this whole investment world. And I think what a lot of people don't recognize is that there's a big difference between saving and investing. Historically, saving is just excess capital you've earned through your job and you're putting aside as like a vehicle that can hopefully improve your life down in the long term. Investing, on the other hand, is taking risk to try and better that return. But as a result of taking risk, well, you could potentially lose that capital, and you've got the time investment of trying to figure out where to invest that capital. And so I think that today, everyone and their dog has to become an investor, and they've got to figure out the financial markets, equities, real estate, all of these things to try and get by, and simply because saving is no longer a viable solution.
Yeah, it's interesting to think the implications of if money just retained its purchasing power. Not even getting into if we're in a deflationary market, but if money simply retained its purchasing power over a prolonged period of time, how much simpler that would make so many conversations and decisions. And of course, like let's think about the housing industry. Of course, you're going to have areas of centralized like inflation or deflation because of maybe like outsized population growth. But in general, if the population, if the average home stayed flat compared to the purchasing power of a dollar, and you knew I need to have 20% down, I want to have $50,000 down, and I can afford to save $10,000 per year. In 5 years, I will have X. Versus we're forced to speculate. Well, I need 50 grand right now, but the housing market, it was like 2021, the average house in the town we live in went up by 33%. So suddenly you're speculating on your to buy a house. All right, I want to buy a house in a couple of years, but if the house goes up by 33%, I need to at least have my money go up by 33%. That way I'm not losing ground on that. So now you have to go and invest. And of course, then you have, if, let's say inflation's 5% and you invest your money and you make 10%, five of that is just to keep up with inflation. But the government's not recognizing that from a tax perspective. So you're paying capital gains tax on the first 5% that actually just kept pace with inflation. So the more you start thinking through this, the more, it can lead to frustration.
Totally.
You're
And I think that
the amount of time and energy wasted.
And I think that the other thing is a lot of these narratives get weaponized politically. And so, like, where I live is extremely left leaning. And what ends up happening is people say, well, landlords are the worst and corporations are the worst. All of these rising prices and the heinous rental rates are because of landlords and corporations. And it's just like, come on, peel back the layer, at least one more layer. And as you start peeling back the layer, you realize it's got nothing to do with corporations and landlords. Yes, you can get the greedy landlord here and there. Yes, you can find the occasional corporation that is just kind of raising prices unnecessarily just to maximize margins. But in general, people are a product of their environment. And I think that when money, to your point, Jim, when money does not store purchasing power, what ends up happening is if you have capital in the bank, what are you going to do? You're not just going to keep it in the dollar. You're going to try and preserve that purchasing power somewhere else. And so people are now pushed out into things like real estate, pushed out into things like farmland, not because they actually want to go and own real estate and farmland, but it's simply to preserve purchasing power. And so these vehicles now become stores of value. They become assets as opposed to these things that were once just utility vehicles for society. And we see it time and time again, like the wealthy are buying up farmland left, right, and center all over the world, but they're not using that farmland to grow crops or to raise cattle to provide food for society. Instead, they're using it simply to preserve purchasing power. Where I live in Canada, I used to live in Whistler, a little ski town in here in BC in Canada, and 61% of the houses are empty, yet we've got a housing crisis. And it's got nothing to do with the wealthy buying up the houses to preserve purchasing power. What it's got everything to do with is the fact that our money doesn't store value. So they're pushed into real estate to preserve purchasing power. And so a lot of these rise in prices is a result of artificial demand because there's no incentive to save in the currency.
Yeah, that's monetization of assets. And that's the frustration. If you have a family that's just trying to go get a home to raise their family in and make memories together and a place that they can call home, they're not just competing against another family who's also trying to get a home. They're competing against hedge funds and private equity and mutual funds and real estate investment trusts. And all these people are not using it as a home. It's an investment asset. And also we have this demand that bloats the prices. And suddenly the family who just wants a home is forced out because there's someone else who can outbid them because they need a place to park their purchasing power. And again, that's a symptom of the fact that the money itself is not doing one of its primary roles, which is storing money or storing purchasing power across time.
And I think this is where, when you've got the stickiness of wages, unfortunately, the onus is on the employee to be able to request their employer raises their wage. And if the employer even has the capacity to raise their wage, what we find is that wages lag inflation. And so you end up with these individuals where, again, like talking about house prices here in Canada, and I know it's pretty similar in the States, the average house in the 1970s was 3 times the average person's wage. Well, now the average house is 9.7 times the average person's wage. And if you live in a desirable location, so like I live 30 minutes south of Whistler in a little town called Squamish, the average house here is 1.5 million, and the average person's wage is like $30,000 to $40,000 a year. And you're just like, how on earth are they ever going to be able to buy a house when it's 30 times the average person's wage? It's just kind of just getting ridiculous. And so I think that, again, I really urge like people, when we first go down this rabbit hole, sometimes we can get stuck on the symptom, and it's like asking the question to get behind the symptom. There was a famous founder of Toyota. His name is Takoda something. I've a complete blank his name. It's an Asian name. And what he talks about is the 5 whys. And he was like, okay, I want everyone in Toyota to be a critical thinker. If you have a problem, get to the root. Don't just focus on the symptom. And so he asks everyone to ask the question of why 5 times minimum. And so he's just like, okay, let's say we're talking about rising prices in grocery stores. Well, why are prices rising? That's the first question. You could say, well, the grocery store is raising prices. Yeah, that could be the answer. Why is the grocery store raising prices? Well, it's because the cost of goods are increasing. So why are the cost of goods increasing? Well, the input costs that go into those goods are increasing. Why are the input costs of goods going into this? Because there's more demand for those resources. Why is there more demand? Because there's more dollars. Why are there more dollars? Because there's a central bank. And so you start digging down deeper, asking why, and you actually get to the root. And so it's just like being able to get people, rather than just superficially asking why once, go deeper, get to the root of these issues. And many times you realize, and it's not even just rising prices, it can be anything. Why is it that kids today are struggling and they're not having their emotional needs met? Well, it could be the fact that since 1970 to present day, we've seen a doubling of dual earner households and a halving of single earner households, where both parents are having to go out and work. So if both parents are working, they're spending less time with their kids. If kids are spending more time with their peers, well, peer relationships are very superficial. They want to sound the same, look the same mannerisms. And then you wonder, when a kid hasn't individuated, he doesn't know who he is, he's got no sense of purpose. You wonder why we're facing depression, anxiety, and such. And I would argue it's because money, again, is breaking down the relationship between the parent and the child. And so, again, I think that money really is at the root of so many of the challenges we face in society.
Yeah, I'd agree. I appreciate. I know we sort of went a lot of directions, and we sort of teased out like, okay, well, clearly for the last hour we've harped on the fact that we think something's wrong with our current money problem, and maybe we can have you come back sometime and we'll talk through what we think the solution is. But I guess from this conversation, is there anything, like, if you had to summarize in one bullet point, Cade, Seb, like, what would you like? What's the one little nugget you would want someone to walk away with?
I not to steal Seb's words, but I think it's a great way to describe it. Is most people are experiencing the symptoms of a broken money system, and I think everyone should pause and try to understand the root of the brokenness instead of continue to just feel like, man, maybe this is my fault. I'm in this rat race. There's nothing I can do about this. Pause and try to understand the root of the symptoms you're experiencing.
I love that. And I think that, like, kind of echoing that, it's this idea that life is getting harder, and it doesn't have to be that way. But I think the key thing, and I'm sure you guys probably resonate, is that the circles in which we walk in and some of the individuals we spend our time with, these individuals that we were spending our time with in Montana, I would say if there's one thing that kind of the common thread amongst all of these individuals is curiosity. And it's just like, be curious, question things, dig deeper, try to be malleable. And it's kind of like this idea of like strong opinions loosely held. It's just like, absolutely debate and try to show up as your best self, and don't character attack, and question like, I have this belief. Is this belief accurate? Am I simply holding this belief because I was told that's the way that it is when I went through school? And kind of be curious about these kind of beliefs that we hold. And I very much urge people, like the most inspiring, like curious individuals, it's amazing how you end up finding yourselves down very similar paths.
Yeah, I think it's important to be willing to ask the questions that might seem like they're too simple. I wish I'd have known that when I was in high school and middle school, high school, college, was being willing to ask the stupid questions, because I realized once I was bold enough to start asking those that everyone else was actually wondering the same thing. They were just afraid to ask it. So again, just be willing to ask, why? Why is this the case? Okay, what is this? What's a ruler? What is money? And it might sound like a silly question in its simplicity, but I would venture to say these are questions that most people have not stopped to ask. And if you can get to that first principle, that root question, only from there can you build out on a strongly and structurally as you get further and further out on these things that you're trying to build upon. So be willing to ask those simple questions. Speaking of simple questions, Seb, Cade and I was in the show asking each other just a goofy question of the day. I usually go with, I like to ask my kids questions. So one of my questions we had recently was, if you could have any animal as a pet, and you wouldn't have to worry about it like harming you or destroying the house. If you could have any animal as a pet, what would it be?
Oh man, that is such a good question. If I could have any, you know what? You may have seen during this podcast, I had a husky that walked out of this door behind me, wandered up behind me, and then tried to go outside. And I was like, nope, I'm on a podcast right now. But I love like wolf dogs. I would love to have a wolf. like an actual wolf. I just think it would just be phenomenal. And I think at some point in my life I will. It would be amazing to have like an acreage and to be able to raise a pack of wolves that otherwise have they've kind of we have a problem, I would say, in Canada and even in the US in general, where I think some people they like the idea of having a wolf dog, so they adopt a wolf, and then they realize way too much. I've got an apartment. I can't have a wolf in an apartment.
Wait a
And
second,
so
that's a wolf. They
it's,
realize that.
it's a wolf. And so it'd be nice to be able to have like an acreage to be able to, these dogs that have been kind of rehomed that don't have the capacity to go live in the wild again, to be able to still give them the space to be able to roam and stuff. I would absolutely love that. I'm curious about you, Cade. What would you go with?
I would say bald eagle. I've always been fascinated by birds of prey. I think they're majestic and incredible. And if I could have a bald eagle come land on my shoulder and hang out with me all day long, that'd be really neat.
Man, you should. So where I live here in Squamish, it's bald eagle capital of the world. We have so many bald eagles flying around all the time. And do you guys see them down in Texas? Like, do they make it down that far?
Sometimes, yes.
Rarely,
Actually,
occasionally.
in this part of we've seen a couple in this area, and actually where we lived before this was in southeast Oklahoma, and we did see them occasionally.
Oh my god, they're one of the most like majestic birds. You know,
Yeah.
a few years back, I used to work in the school district as kind of like a support teacher, and we used to do these little activities. And we went to this place called Elphinstone Campground, and it's basically just like a camp for kids, getting them out into nature, doing your standard things, canoeing and woodworking and stuff like that. And anyway, I was sat on the beach one evening. It was October, November, and here it's quite cold. It was only just above freezing, and all of the kids wanted to do like a polar dips, jump in the cold water. And I sat there with one of the other teachers, and I look over, and there's a bald eagle at the top of one of these big cedar trees that's probably 300 foot tall. And this bald eagle, huge bald eagle, sat at the top, and then it just like jumps, dives into like a quick like tucked wing dive, picks out a salmon out of the water, and then just flies off with a full size salmon. I just remember just being like, oh my god, like nature truly is incredible. When you spend time in nature and you see these animals in their element, these birds in their element, it's profound.
Yeah, that would be really neat. I've seen in Wyoming fly fishing. I've gotten some really good pictures of eagles perched up in a tree right next to the river. I've never gotten to see one dive down and grab a fish, but yeah, I definitely would have a bald eagle if I could. Jim?
Seb, Cade, do you have a oh, well, for me, I don't know, maybe a bear. If
Oh yeah.
I think everyone wants to cuddle with a bear, but then we realize that, oh yeah, it's a bear and it would eat me. But I would love to. I think it'd be fun to have a bear, be able to cuddle up with, and it's big enough you can also ride on it. So that'd be pretty awesome.
Isn't there the guy, the grizzly guy, that he raised grizzlies? I think they were his best friends, but then eventually one just turned one day and ate him. I think
Yeah,
so.
yeah. He would get dropped off and live with them in Alaska for a couple of months every summer, and then one day, I think they said it was a new bear that he didn't recognize, and it ate him. So yeah.
As for questions, the only thing that comes to mind, and this is a super random question, and so you can answer it however you want to. Years ago, I went to this job interview, and at the very end of the interview, similar to this, they had just like a random question, and the random question was, if you were a sandwich or a burger, what sandwich or burger best describes your personality?
Oh man.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's tough. For me, I'll go and say maybe a club sandwich because it seems like a really common thing at the surface level. Like it's just a club sandwich. You can get that anywhere, but there are layers of complexity that make the club sandwich what it is.
I love that.
Mine's like the opposite. I would for me it'd probably be mine would be a grilled cheese because it's super simple, but you can still make it really good. If you do it well, it's simple but can still be great.
It's like the Michelin star grilled cheese.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
You know what I'd say? I've always been curious about just like making really, really good quality food. And so I went deep down the rabbit hole of sourdough bread for a while before I went carnivore. And then I realized I probably shouldn't be eating grain and was devastated. But I bought like a mill, would bring in kind of like organic grain from one of the local farms, mill the grain. So it'd probably be some, I would say it would be some like grass-fed beef of some sort on like a handmade like sourdough loaf with freshly milled grain. And it's just about like the quality of ingredients, being conscious about and intentional about what goes into it.
Nice. I don't know. We didn't really get to talk too much in Montana. My wife is super organic-y and she buys organic raw grain and she soaks it and sprouts it and dehydrates it and then mills all of her own grain. So like last night we had breakfast for dinner. So we had waffles with the grain that she ground and milled and all that stuff. Or Friday night's pizza night. She makes the dough and tortillas and all that. So it's pretty cool. It's good.
That is so cool. And you know what? Like I would say, walking in these circles, especially everyone again that we were around in Montana, being around people that are curious, being around people that are increasingly seeing their capacity increase. It's amazing how their focus becomes, and it's just like, I want to be conscious about what I put in my body. I want to be conscious about who I spend my time with. I want to be conscious about how I show up in the world, spending more time in nature. And I love it. Absolutely love it. People that want to be intentional about how they show up. I think it's just one of the most rewarding things being around such individuals.
Yeah, dude. Cade, what you got?
My question?
Yeah.
Ooh, would you rather be able to fall asleep instantly or not need to sleep?
Could I still sleep if I wanted to, but don't need to?
That's a really good point.
That is a good point. I didn't think that deeply about it.
I can already fall asleep pretty
I'll say
instantly.
no. I'll say
Oh
no.
man. Well, if I don't need to, I guess I can just relax. I guess not need to sleep. I enjoy sleeping, but I can rest through other things. So if I didn't need to sleep, I can go rest by reading a book, laying by the fire, laying in my hammock. So I'll go that way. I can already fall asleep pretty much instantly every night because I'm so stinking tired by the time I get the kids down. So that's not an issue. It's nice, but maybe I'll give not needing to sleep a try.
Okay.
I, wa-
Seb?
I wonder, like, man, this is a tough one because to me, I would classify myself as like a extroverted introvert, as in like I'm not really a big fan of like big group environments when there's a lot of people that I don't necessarily know. But I
Mhm.
when I'm in these tight knit communities, when you're around people you care about, I can be quite extroverted. And the thing is, I still really appreciate, even though I'd say that I'm overly introverted in many ways, I still really appreciate socializing. And I think that if you lived on schedule where you're awake and everyone else is asleep, I think it'd be really hard. I've definitely seen people that do like night shifts. They've got much higher rates of depression and all of these
Yeah.
kind of things.
That's just curious, the psychological impact of not needing to sleep and how that would wear on day
Yeah.
after day. I think that'd be really bad for you.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're kind of
I
out of sync with everyone else.
Yeah.
yeah. I
If you have
struggle to
supplement
fall
instead
asleep
of
and stay
sleeping,
asleep.
So you're going with being able to fall asleep instantly.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
just go have a few more kids and then it won't be a problem.
Yeah,
The
that
moment Kendra every night I hear her take a drink of water, close her water bottle, turn off the lamp, and then I don't remember anything after that.
I've always struggled to fall asleep and stay asleep, so I don't know that adding more kids would help. It would give my mind one more thing to stew on while I was trying to fall asleep. So
It's fair. Well, fellas, thanks for hanging out. It's a good conversation.
No,
yeah, it was awesome.
great to see you guys again. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing you guys in person again. And really appreciate having me on. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Yes, sir. Thanks.